Okay, now we're going to look at some angle pair relationships. So when we have two angles, they can sometimes be described as adjacent angles, which means that they're right beside one another and they have a ray and a vertex in common. So if I take a look at this diagram here on the right, I have angle SRT. I also have angle MRT. Angle SRT and angle MRT, they share ray RT and they share point R. That's their vertex that they have in common. So because they share a vertex and a ray, these two angles are considered adjacent angles. So angle SRT and angle MRT are adjacent. The next term, complementary. So complementary means that the sum of both angles is 90 degrees, which is a right angle. Taking a look at this diagram, I see that the measure of angle L is 30 degrees. And I see that the measure of angle V is 60 degrees. Well, if I sum them, or if I add them together, I do get 90 degrees. So because I'm getting 90 degrees for their sum, I can say that these two angles are complementary. Or I could say the complement of angle V is angle L, or the complement of angle L is angle V. So they're complementary angles. Now, in this particular example, the two complementary angles were two separate angles. But if I go back up and take a look at the first diagram, I can see that the two of those angles form a right angle, or a 90-degree angle. So because they form a right angle, those two angles in the first diagram are also complementary angles. So I'm going to add angle SRT and angle MRT. I'm going to add that to the list of complementary angles because the sum of both of their angles is 90 degrees. So they are complementary angles as well. Next, we're going to take a look at the next term, which is supplementary angles. So supplementary angles mean that the sum of both angles is 180 degrees. So we take a look at this example. Both angles are marked as 90-degree angles. So when I add 90 degrees, angle R, when I add it to the measure of angle R, when I add it to the measure of angle T, I'm getting 90 degrees plus 90 degrees, which is 180 degrees. So the sum is 180 degrees, which means that angle R and angle T are supplementary angles, or the supplement of angle R is angle T, and the supplement of angle T is angle R. Now in that particular example, the two angles were separate, but sometimes supplementary angles can be adjacent to one another as well. So if I take a look at this next picture, next diagram, I see we have two angles here, angle KLM and also angle KLA. KLA. Those two angles, if I add their measures, I do get 180 degrees. So that means that those two angles are what we call supplementary. They're supplementary angles. Now, that leads us to another term. The next term is linear pair, which is supplementary angles that are adjacent, and together they form a line. So in this particular example that we just looked at, we said angle KLM and angle KLA, those are supplementary angles. Well, we've also just determined that those angles are a linear pair. They do together form a line, and their measures sum 180 degrees. So they're not only supplementary because the measures sum 180 degrees, but they're also a linear pair because they are supplementary angles who are also adjacent. So I'm going to add angle KLM and angle KLA to the group of linear pairs. Now we have several linear pairs. We could also say that angle PLA and angle KLA they're also a linear pair, PLA and KLA. Together they form a line. So they are a linear pair, and they are also supplementary because their measures add to 180 degrees. So that's linear pair. Last, we're going to take a look at vertical angles. Vertical angles are two angles where the sides of one are the opposite rays to the sides of the other. That's sometimes hard to understand based on the definition. It's easier when you're taking a look at the diagram. So, as we can take a look at this diagram here, if I'm looking at angle KLM, well, the angle that is vertical to it is angle ALP. I like to think of them as separately, they make V's, V for vertical. Here's another V upside down, of course. But together, the two V's form an X. And those two angles, angle KLM and angle PLA, they are what we call vertical angles. Now, one other thing we need to talk about is the fact that vertical angles are always congruent. Always congruent, which means their angles have the same measure. So if I'm taking a look at the two angles we just described as vertical angles, angle KLM and angle PLA, they are vertical angles. So if they're vertical angles, that means that their angles are congruent. So I can go ahead and mark the same markings in both because I just said that vertical angles are congruent. And if that angle KLM is marked with 100 degrees, I can now add that angle PLA also measures 100 degrees because they are vertical angles, and vertical angles are always congruent. Now, of course, there's more than just those two vertical angles. We could also say that angle KLA and angle MLP are vertical angles. And because they're vertical angles, I'm going to mark them as congruent, but I've already used the single line for the marking, so now I'll put a double line to mark that those two angles are congruent, and I will, which then means that angle MLP measures 80 degrees.